Hi everyone, I just got back from the MongoDB World Conference in New York, where I got to talk about my favorite subject, MACH Architecture. I was asked to speak about MACH Architecture in a presentation called MACH Matters. I used the Amplience story to talk about all of the technical decisions and the architectural decisions we made to move into MACH Architecture and grow into one of the founding members of the MACH Alliance. It was a fantastic response, and I got to talk to so many people afterwards about MACH Architecture and why it's so important. So when I got back, I thought I would reproduce the presentation, but in a slightly different format that would match this channel and match YouTube. And I hope you enjoy it. So let's waste no more time. Let's get to it. And if you haven't guessed it already, the reason why I'm so passionate about MACH Architecture is it's because of these principles that helped us build a company, Amplience, from being a small startup into a global leading headless CMS. So we've went from a tiny little company in the UK to powering some of the world's biggest e-commerce and retail digital experiences. We literally went from thousands of content requests to hundreds of billion content requests per month. And the reasons why I believe we're so successful are all of those decisions we made along our journey, all of those technical decisions and those architectural decisions we made as a team when we built the platform. You could say that many of these were architectural bets that we had at the beginning that have really paid off. And many of those bets have been around the MACH principles. And I'll describe and I'll go through those principles later. While you're watching this video, listen out for the detailed story of our first product and how the challenges to that product led to its ultimate extinction, but also how the challenges led to some real innovation and ultimately led to our leading global product. But first of all, let's look at the past and the architectural patterns of the past. We've always tried to make software modular. We've always tried to take the complex in software and abstract it out into components and then abstract it further into layers. And this is really how I used to design software myself in the past when I was working in digital agency. It looks really nice and neat in its little layers and its separated components. The reality is, once you start implementing these components and the platform, it gets messy. Because in this world, components are tightly coupled together. They have to be joined together using layers of code. And once you start doing that, you start to get interdependencies between the components, interdependencies between the layers. Ultimately, what happens is the whole system becomes fused together as you start putting coding, patches, and layers into the system. And what you ended up with is the monolith. And the problem with the monolith is the more that you develop it, the harder it gets to maintain, the slower the development, test, and release cycles become. It's much harder to be agile. In fact, scaling these systems can be quite tricky. You could scale the entire monolith and keep replicating it out horizontally, and that is fine, except that if you want to scale just one individual component, you're scaling the whole thing. It's very difficult to implement scaling at a component level. And one major downside of the monolith is that it was ultimately designed for one purpose. And often that purpose was to create an e-commerce site or create a website, and often generating HTML. And today, that is just not adequate because you have to deliver into multiple channels, multiple devices. In fact, in e-commerce, you have to deal with an omni-channel experience, which it's almost impossible to do in the all monolithic way. And this is where MACH Architecture steps in. This is a move away from those big monolithic suites of the past for e-commerce, where everything supposedly worked really well all in one box, into the ability to compose your e-commerce platform and choose the best of breed suppliers, the best suppliers for your particular business. MACH is purpose-built to deal with multi-channel and omni-channel and not just websites. And using MACH Architecture facilitates incremental development as opposed to big bang or the big bang phased approach. And the MACH approach supports the use of product teams as opposed to project teams, giving your teams far more freedom to be agile. And if you didn't already know, MACH is an acronym and it stands for Microservices, API first, cloud native, and headless. Today, I'm not going to give you clear, precise definitions for each one of these concepts, but if you'd like to know more in detail about these concepts, I've already done videos on these, and I'll leave a link in the corner for you to have a look. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through the Amplience story to really help you understand why these concepts are so powerful and how we started using these concepts to build our own platform. It's 12 years ago now since I walked into a small office in the Fruit and Wool Exchange. It was a small office which housed Amplience. I walked into the office and the carpets were orange. I don't think they were originally that colour. And there was this bright young team of about 15 people all working together with my friend and now CEO James Brook. And this for me was the start of Amplience. This is when the team and I got together to build our first product. And that was called interactive merchandising. It basically allowed retailers and brands to build interactive and shoppable media from their existing images and video. You could think about the product as really a CMS for interactive media. The software had two components: a rich WYSIWYG studio for business users to create that engaging and interactive media, and a player that would actually sit on the retailer's side inside their e-commerce journey. And the two components were joined together using an API. The studio would turn the interactive experience into data, transfer it to the player, which would rehydrate it into the same experience that the user had actually built. As you can imagine, when I joined Amplience 12 years ago and there was only 15 people, things weren't quite set up in the same way as I was used to. Things were nowhere near as robust as we have today. We had development servers underneath desks, staging environments, stuck in a rack in a wall. There was a data center for the live and production environment, however. But to move forward in e-commerce, I knew the functional requirements would be much higher than we could manage with that small amount of infrastructure. Customers would want 4.9's availability. They would want to make sure that there was zero downtime. We ultimately wanted this to be a multi-tenanted environment with the ability to scale for all of our customers and enterprise customers. The big problem when you're a small startup is that you can't afford to keep buying more and more infrastructure. You can't afford to keep having big operational teams. You can't afford to be distracted by general maintenance or trying to work out how you're going to separate these into different data centers, how you deal with outages on servers and power outages, all the things that you need to think about to get 4.9's and massive redundancy. So one of the first architectural decisions we made was to move into Amazon AWS and become cloud native. And that decision was one of the best decisions we ever made. It allowed us to gain enterprise scale without having to buy all of the server capacity. It gave us enterprise tooling for scaling and monitoring and security. With very little effort, we got triple-level redundancy, meaning we had our servers in 3 different data centers without having to do hardly any work. It meant that we could be multi-tenanted. It meant that we could scale to whatever size we needed. It meant that we could start to deliver 4.9's availability. It also gave our teams the ability to spin up new development environments, new QA environments, and new test environments. And the number one thing for me being a CTO meant that I could focus on product differentiation, not on the basics of managing the infrastructure. Although we moved to the cloud, I actually inherited a monolith. The base software was built using .NET, complete with SQL Server. And as we started to build out the platform, I suffered from all of the things that everybody suffers when they have a monolith. My development cycles became slower, it got harder to maintain, I started to lose the agility in the team. Although we did have an API that connected the studio and the player, the rest of the system had no APIs. Ultimately, it was a black box, but our customers wanted a more open platform that they could integrate with in more interesting ways. But fortunately, I got the opportunity to change everything when we moved on to building our next product, which was dynamic media. Dynamic media allows customers to use very large master assets for video and images and allows you to transcode them on the fly, completely dynamically. For instance, you could take a very large image in a TIFF format and use it as a thumbnail that's in a JPEG and only 50 pixels wide. You could change the width, you could crop it, you can change the format, you can even superimpose other images and text all in one single image, and it can be all done in one single API call to the imaging service. The primary use case for dynamic media was that of product media. So let me explain. If you go to a product details page, you'll always see multiple images and even a video for each product. Each of those images can come in multiple sizes. You get a zoom image, a standard image, a thumbnail image. You may even get separate image sizes for basket, for checkout, for listing pages. This means if you have thousands of products, you may have tens of thousands of product images, which means that you may have hundreds of thousands of image variants. And this is where the value of dynamic media comes in, because you don't need to manage variants, you just need to have the source images. However, like I said, a single product may have 5, 10, 15 images. And if you've got thousands of products, you're going to need tens of thousands of images. So we needed to build a system that could deal with high volumes. It also meant that automation and integration was far more important than UI. There is just no way on this planet that you are going to manually upload tens of thousands of images for your products. So at a very early stage, we decided to go down an API first route. And what we actually found was it was less about just wrapping the application in APIs and more about thinking about the system, the actual platform in terms of services. Services where our customers can actually extract value out of our platform. Another great benefit we had from this approach was our front end could be decoupled from our back end. The front end was built using AngularJS as an SPA, just integrating with the same APIs that our customers were integrating with. And this gave me even more flexibility when it came to my own teams. I could have a team focused on business UI and getting that right, and the other teams focused on the APIs and the scalability of the platform. We built this product around 9 years ago and we've had some amazing success. And I think it's been down to the fact that we went down an API first approach and it was based on a native cloud infrastructure. This gave us a vast amount of flexibility and some tremendous scale, and it allowed us to dislodge some of our biggest competitors, real Goliaths in the industry from some of the biggest leading e-commerce brands in the world. We have went from 0 requests from the beginning to hundreds of billions of requests a month today. We've went from 0 images to literally hundreds of millions of images in the dam, with millions of images added every month. Okay, so far I talked about our successes. It sounds like a fairy tale story of a successful startup. What I haven't told you about are some of the challenges that we had. I'm going to tell you the full story of our first product, with its highs and its lows, and what ultimately led to its extinction, but also how those challenges led us to building a leading world-class product. IM, as I said, was basically a CMS for managing rich media. They could do all of this in an online studio that would save their compositions and deliver it as an API to a player. And the player would take the data in the API and rehydrate it into an experience. Even placing the player in the e-commerce platform took very little development effort. It was actually quite a cool product. But there's one thing that I didn't tell you. It was built in Flash. Yes, it was built in Flash. After 6 months of joining Amplience, Steve Jobs gets up on the stage and tells the world that Flash is dead. Let me tell you, I found this a bit of a blow. After 6 months starting the company, I find that the primary technology for the most interesting part of the product is now becoming irrelevant. So we got the team together, we went into a room and we looked at the entire product and realized that rebuilding the entire thing in HTML5 would take us months and months and months of development. And back then, HTML5 wasn't really a proper standard. Not every browser could actually implement HTML5. So it's a real quandary what we do. But what we realized was that the most sensitive part of the product was actually the player. It was the player that sits on the customer sites and has to be turned into HTML5. And as we'd already abstracted the content into an API that was hydrated by a Flash player, all we had to do was create a HTML5 player and leave everything else the same. And that was an amazing success because you could have this really high fidelity experience, whether you're on an old IE browser or a brand new Chrome or Safari browser. And after that development, everything went super well. The business started buzzing. And then another thing happened. Mobile browsers became the dominant browsers. Customers had to move towards a mobile-first strategy. We started to move to a multi-channel environment. We started to move to an omni-channel environment. Device screens evolved. We had all kinds of aspect ratios, all kinds of resolutions. Content had to be delivered into many different places. And the problem with this is that ultimately, we were dealing with a model based on a fixed canvas. And not only that, we started to see new JavaScript frameworks arriving and new ways of building things moving towards an app model where the player and embed code model just wouldn't work. So there was an industry change that meant the types of content we were delivering would become irrelevant. There was a technology change emerging, which meant that the technology we used would also become irrelevant, and this would fundamentally endanger our business. However, our customers still needed rich and engaging content. They still needed ways of creating interesting content and then delivering it to all of these multiple channels and all of these devices. And that's when we realized that the value of what we had wasn't in the players, but in the content, in the delivery of the content using an API. But also that content had to be free from the constraints of the presentation. The content couldn't be restricted by how it was going to be presented, which gave rise to the idea of just creating content, not the presentation elements, of saving content in a neutral format and then delivering it as an API that any user experience technology could rehydrate the way that they wanted to hydrate it. In other words, we started to think about content as being content as a service. And that's when we built our first version of a headless CMS, which started to take over the customers that were using the older product. And again, this product was really successful. For me, the key learning is that headless is not just about the API. It's not just taking a system and giving it an API and a user experience accessing that API. Real headless is basically building a system that is completely independent from the actual presentation layer, all the way down to how the data is constructed in the back end. And it's this reason why headless has been so successful and so pervasive as a technology. Okay, I hope you're enjoying this video so far. I hope you're finding our stories really interesting and engaging and really useful. If you are finding them useful and you are finding them engaging, please do me one favor. Please, can you kind of scroll down a little bit and press that like button? And if you really do like this content and you'd like to see more, don't forget to subscribe either. At this point, we had two successful products, Dynamic Media and Dynamic Content. Dynamic Content being our headless CMS. But we still had challenges despite being API first, being on a cloud environment, and actually being a headless system. The problem we had was that we had basically macro APIs or a monolithic API, which is frankly better than the older monolith where the presentation is welded into it. But we were starting to struggle when we wanted to scale the teams. We were separating teams around the technology stacks. So the front-end development, the back-end development, the live service APIs. But to go further and scale the teams, we had to be more product focused. We had to focus on the business value and focus our teams on owning parts of the product based on the business. And this was difficult to do when you've got monolithic APIs that are horizontal. We ultimately decided that if this was a key product and we needed to build it out further with more teams, we needed to fundamentally change the architecture. We need to take all the learnings that we already had from our first version of the CMS and move it into the second one, but take it a step further. So what we decided to do was go down a full microservices route. And this allowed us to separate teams into different areas. Teams had the freedom to choose a technology that was right for that area of the system. It meant that these teams could work independently of each other, that there were no dependencies between the teams. They could just focus on adding value and doing what they needed to do without worrying about the rest of the teams in the business. And what that meant was that we moved from 50 releases a year to almost 1,000 releases a year. It also meant that when we were building this product, we could build it really closely with our customers and align the product owners with our customers. So what we built was exactly what our customers needed. Having a better team organization and a better technology architecture led to more rapid development, but having more alignment with the business and customers meant that the product ended up being far more successful. And today it is one of the leading headless CMSs in the world. So I believe that going down a microservices route, being API first, being cloud native, and really delivering headless in the right way is the thing that has made us so successful. It's these architectural bets that have really paid off. The main question I get asked personally all of the time is, what do I think the greatest benefit to MACH is? Why do I honestly believe that the MACH architectural approach is the right approach? And how I really think about this is when I go back to those 3 inflection points we've had in the business. Flash being dead, the industry change from desktop to mobile to multi-channel to omni-channel, and obviously the most recent one of being COVID. Now, all businesses have these types of challenges. There is constant change in the market, and that change is not slowing down. That change is becoming more and more rapid and more profound. No doubt, when you're out there talking to architects, talking to analysts, talking to platform providers and vendors, they're all talking about building something that's future-proof. Let me tell you, that is impossible. You can't make something future-proof. You don't know what those changes are going to be. If you don't know what the change is going to be, how can you provide proof against it? It is impossible. But what you can do is be ready for change. And that's what I think the most powerful thing about MACH principles are. The fact that you can be ready for change. So rather than be future-proof, you can be future-ready. If you'd like to know more about the providers of MACH architecture, whether it's vendors, SIs, or enablers, take a look at the MACH Alliance website. And if you'd like to hear more about MACH architecture from me, and you'd like to learn a little bit more about MACH architecture, the components and architectural patterns, why not take a look at this playlist or even this video? But for now, it's time to say thank you, goodbye, and I'll see you next time.